If you've spent any time in the corners of the internet dedicated to ancient mysteries, you've probably encountered some version of this claim, that one of the early kings of Sumer was excavated alongside a skeleton too large, too strange, or too anatomically different to belong to an ordinary human being. Proof, according to the theory, that Sumer's earliest rulers were not fully human at all, but descendants of beings called the Anunnaki, sometimes connected to a wider mythology of ancient astronauts visiting Earth in its earliest days. This claim shows up across dozens of videos, blog posts, and forum threads, almost always citing the same handful of sources. We are going to trace every one of those sources back to where it actually started, because the real origin story, once you follow it carefully, runs through 19th century cuneiform scholarship, a wildly popular but heavily disputed series of books from the 1970s, and a digital photo hoax born on internet forums roughly 20 years ago. None of it leads to an actual skeleton that doesn't match a known species. Let's start with the Anunnaki, because the term itself is genuinely ancient and genuinely Sumerian, even if its modern usage has drifted enormously from its original meaning. In actual Sumerian and Akkadian religious texts, the Anunnaki were a broad category of deities associated with the underworld and with the larger Mesopotamian pantheon, mentioned across multiple texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and various ritual and mythological tablets. They are gods in the conventional ancient Near Eastern religious sense, comparable to how the Greek pantheon included major Olympian gods alongside numerous lesser deities. Nothing in the original Sumerian or Akkadian textual record describes the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors, genetic engineers, or the literal biological ancestors of a Mesopotamian ruling dynasty. That specific interpretation has a clearly traceable, much more recent origin. That origin point is the work of Zecharia Sitchin, a writer who, beginning in 1976 with a book called The 12th Planet, proposed that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings who had visited Earth in ancient times, genetically engineered early humans, and ruled as the first kings and gods of Mesopotamian civilization. Sitchin's work drew heavily on his own translations and interpretations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, interpretations that the overwhelming majority of professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists, the scholars who actually specialize in reading and translating these ancient languages, have rejected as inaccurate based on documented misreadings of specific cuneiform terms and astronomical references. This is not a minor academic disagreement at the edges of an otherwise accepted theory. Specialists in the field have published detailed point-by-point analyses showing that Sitchin's translations do not hold up against the actual grammar and vocabulary of the source texts, examined using the same rigorous philological methods used to translate every other Sumerian and Akkadian document in the archaeological record. Sitchin's books remain commercially popular and continue to circulate widely, but within the actual academic field that studies these languages and texts professionally, his core claims are considered unsupported by the primary source material. Even within Sitchin's own framework, though, the claim was always about divine or extraterrestrial ancestry, expressed through long reigns and elevated status, not about literal, physically anomalous skeletal remains pulled from the ground. The skeleton-specific version of this myth has a separate and much more recent origin, one that traces directly back to the early internet, rather than to any archaeological excavation. Starting in the early 2000s, a series of digitally manipulated photographs began circulating across forums and early social media, depicting archaeologists standing in excavation trenches beside skeletons many times the size of an ordinary human being, with captions claiming various ancient discoveries, sometimes attributed generically to biblical giants, sometimes connected loosely to ancient Mesopotamian rulers. Multiple independent investigations into the origin of these specific images, conducted by researchers and fact-checking organizations over the years since, traced several of the most widely shared versions directly back to entries submitted to online digital photo manipulation contests, communities of digital artists who created and shared deliberately fake, clearly labeled composite images as a creative exercise, images that were later stripped of their original context and recirculated as if they depicted genuine archaeological finds. No museum, university archaeology department, or peer-reviewed excavation report anywhere has ever corroborated the discovery of an anomalously sized or non-human skeleton connected to any Sumerian king or any other ancient Mesopotamian ruler. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is a genuinely strong negative claim, and strong negative claims deserve real scrutiny rather than simply being accepted. The reason we can say this with real confidence is that Mesopotamian archaeology is an extremely well-documented field, with excavation records, conservation reports, and skeletal analyses published and cross-checked by physical anthropologists across multiple countries and multiple generations of research. An anomalous skeletal discovery on the scale these viral images describe would represent one of the single most important biological and historical findings in human history, and a discovery of that magnitude simply could not remain confined to forum posts and uncredited viral images. It would appear in peer-reviewed journals, museum collections, and international news coverage, verified independently by multiple research institutions, the way every other major archaeological discovery in this field actually has been documented. We do, however, have real extensively documented skeletal evidence connected directly to early Sumerian royalty, and it tells a very different, considerably more grounded story. Between 1922 and 1934, archaeologist Leonard Woolley led excavations at the ancient city of Ur, uncovering the royal cemetery of Ur, a set of burial chambers containing some of the richest and best preserved grave goods recovered anywhere from the ancient Near East. The tomb, identified as belonging to a woman named Puabi, based on inscribed cylinder seals found within it, contained an elaborate headdress made of gold leaves, gold and lapis lazuli jewelry, and the remains of numerous attendants whose burials suggest a ritual sacrifice accompanying the primary interment, a genuinely striking and well-studied practice within early Sumerian royal burial customs. Physical anthropologists, who have studied the skeletal remains recovered from these tombs in the decades since Woolley's original excavation, have consistently found ordinary human skeletal anatomy, fully consistent with the population of the region during that period, showing no anomalies suggesting any departure from typical human biology. The reign lengths recorded in the separate Sumerian king list, the document listing rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years before a great flood, sometimes get folded into the same giant king mythology as supporting evidence, so it's worth addressing them directly here too. Assyriologists studying the list have generally concluded that these extreme figures reflect the Sumerians' base 60 numerical system, combined with a recognized ancient literary convention of assigning extraordinarily long reigns to legendary, foundational pre-flood rulers as a way of signaling their sacred antiquity and divine favor, a literary device that shows up in comparable form across multiple unrelated ancient cultures, including the similarly inflated lifespans recorded for figures in other ancient flood narratives. This convention reflects a shared ancient approach to constructing legitimacy and mythic depth around founding figures, not a literal record of biological lifespan, and it has nothing to do with skeletal anomalies one way or the other. There's a useful broader lesson buried in how thoroughly this particular myth manages to blend three completely separate real historical threads: genuine ancient religious terminology, a popular but academically rejected modern reinterpretation of that terminology, and an unrelated internet photo hoax, into something that feels, on the surface, like a single coherent ancient mystery. Each piece is real in its own right. The Anunnaki really are ancient Sumerian deities, attested directly in genuine cuneiform texts. Sitchin's books really were enormously popular and really did propose extraterrestrial ancestry for Mesopotamian rulers. The giant skeleton photographs really did circulate widely online and really were treated by many viewers as genuine archaeological discoveries. What's missing at every single step where this myth would need actual physical evidence to hold up? A real translated cuneiform text describing extraterrestrial genetic engineering, a real peer-reviewed excavation report describing anomalous skeletal remains is exactly that. Real, verifiable physical evidence. Trace the claim all the way down, and what you consistently find underneath it is rejected translation work, a since-traced digital hoax, and a literary convention about reign lengths that specialists in the field resolved generations ago. What remains, once you strip all of that away, is something considerably more grounded but no less worth knowing. A genuine ancient civilization, the actual historical Sumerians, who built some of the very first cities, developed one of the earliest writing systems in human history, buried their rulers with breathtaking wealth and craftsmanship, and left behind religious and literary texts sophisticated enough that people are still arguing about how to interpret them 4,000 years later. None of that required extraterrestrial ancestry or anomalous bones to be remarkable. It was remarkable on its own terms the entire time. It's worth spending a little more time on exactly how the academic rejection of Sitchin's translations actually works, because experts disagree is a phrase that gets thrown around loosely in a lot of ancient mystery content, often without ever explaining what the actual disagreement consists of. Sumerian and Akkadian are dead languages, reconstructed and translated through more than a century and a half of painstaking comparative philological work, cross-referencing thousands of tablets, building detailed grammars and dictionaries, and training new generations of specialists at universities around the world, specifically in how to read these scripts accurately. When Assyriologists evaluate Sitchin's specific translations, particularly his interpretation of certain astronomical and mythological terms as references to additional planets in the solar system and to genetic engineering, they are not offering a competing interpretation of an ambiguous text. They are pointing to specific words and grammatical structures where Sitchin's proposed translation does not match how those same words and structures are used consistently across the much larger body of surviving Sumerian and Akkadian literature, identified through the same comparative method used to translate every other text in these languages, including business records, legal documents, and royal inscriptions that have nothing to do with mythology at all, and provide a large, consistent body of vocabulary to check disputed terms against. This is a fundamentally different kind of disagreement than a matter of competing scholarly opinion on an ambiguous passage. It is closer to identifying a translation that does not match the actual grammar of the source language. It's also worth being clear-eyed about why a theory like this one continues to spread so persistently despite that level of academic rejection, because understanding the mechanism matters more than simply restating that the theory is wrong. Sitchin's framework offers something genuinely compelling. A unifying explanation connecting multiple separate ancient mysteries, the origin of civilization, the meaning of ancient religious texts, the construction of monumental architecture, into a single coherent narrative. Conventional archaeology and historical linguistics, by contrast, generally offer a collection of separate, sometimes incomplete, often genuinely uncertain answers to each of those questions individually, answers that frequently come with appropriate scholarly hedging rather than total certainty. A single dramatic unifying story is, for most people, encountering it casually online, simply more satisfying and more memorable than a set of careful, hedged, individually sourced academic conclusions, even when the academic conclusions are the ones actually supported by the evidence. That gap between what is satisfying to hear and what is actually supported by the source material is where claims like this one consistently thrive. There's one more real, well-documented piece of Mesopotamian history worth bringing into this picture, because it actually does involve something genuinely larger than life, just not in the literal, skeletal sense the giant king theory requires. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest and most celebrated works of literature to survive from the ancient world, describes its central character as 2/3 divine and only 1/3 human, the offspring of a mortal king and a goddess, and explicitly describes him in physically extraordinary terms, towering over other men, possessing superhuman strength and endurance. Some retellings of the giant Sumerian king myth point directly to this passage as supporting evidence. But this is precisely the same kind of literary convention found throughout ancient heroic literature across multiple, completely unrelated cultures, all comparable to how Greek mythology describes demigod heroes like Achilles or Heracles as physically superior to ordinary mortals because of their partial divine ancestry, a storytelling device meant to communicate a character's exceptional legendary status within the narrative, not a literal biological or anatomical claim intended to be tested against an actual skeleton. Ancient audiences hearing the Epic of Gilgamesh performed or read aloud understood this kind of larger-than-life description as a marker of heroic, legendary stature. The same way modern audiences understand a superhero's exaggerated physical abilities in a comic book without assuming the character is meant to be taken as a literal biological possibility. So when you trace every thread of this story back to its actual origin, what you find is a pattern that shows up again and again across this entire genre of ancient mystery content. Genuine ancient terminology and genuinely impressive archaeology get borrowed as a credible-sounding foundation. A much more recent and far less rigorously supported reinterpretation gets layered directly on top of that foundation. And finally, a piece of unrelated digital media, created for an entirely different purpose, gets stripped of its original context and presented as the missing physical proof tying the whole theory together. Each individual piece, the real Anunnaki of Sumerian religion, the real popularity of Sitchin's books, the real viral spread of the skeleton photographs, is true in isolation. None of them connect to each other the way the theory claims they do, and at no point in that chain does an actual, physically examined, anomalous skeleton ever enter the picture. It's also worth asking what we should actually do with a popular but unsupported theory like this one, beyond simply rejecting it. The honest answer is not to dismiss every part of the underlying interest as foolish. Curiosity about the very earliest civilizations, about how cities, writing, and organized religion first emerged, about why ancient people told the stories they told, is genuinely well placed. Sumer deserves that curiosity. It was, after all, one of the very first places on Earth where human beings figured out how to build cities, organize large-scale agriculture, and write down their own thoughts for someone else to read thousands of years later. The mistake is not in being fascinated by Sumer. The mistake is in reaching for an extraterrestrial or biologically anomalous explanation when the real, well-documented human history turns out to be more than sufficient to explain everything we actually find in the ground, in the texts, and in the bones.